Yeah.
Are we recording? Okay, great. Call to order the meeting of the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District Managers, September 12, 2019. All managers are present except Manager Hejmati and Manager Miller. There is no member of the public here, so we'll move on to approval of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Manager Rodness, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Olson, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We have no information items, so we'll go to the consent agenda. And here we've asked to have, by Manager Miller, to ask to remove item 7.2 from consent. So we will put that resolution 19077 at 11.7 on the agenda. With that change, is there a motion to adopt the consent agenda?
So moved.
Manager Maxwell, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Broadness, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? I have three items to mention, three kinds of items, I guess, categories for President's Report. One is meetings I've attended since our last meeting. Another is liaison appointments, and the third is a proposed meeting date change. On behalf of Maud, I went to the Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District 50th anniversary. Very nice event, very nice event. And some of our former staff were there, which always adds to the fun. And then I went to the Pearson Lake Water Quality meeting together with Mr. Whisker, Ms. Brown, and Manager Olson. We have a letter, we were all copying the letter that Mr. Whisker sent in response to the issues raised in that meeting. Then I went to the Strategic Communications preliminary research findings along with staff consultants and the other liaisons, Manager Loftus and Manager Miller. And that, as it evolves, be coming back into Planning and Policy Committee meetings in September and October as that moves along. I also went to an event sponsored or convened by the Environmental Institute called Equity and the Environment in the Waltz Administration. And it was statewide, environment-wide, every department-wide. So they talked about a lot of issues. There was a great focus on working with tribal governments. And all the state departments have offices now that are really tuned into equity questions, so they're working at that very hard. The takeaways for me, I think, to bring back here were just underscoring the value of environmental justice and proper engagement with the communities, and then equitable hiring. One specific thing that occurred to me was that there's a lot of move to put native language translations on signages like Bedote for, for Fort Snelling, and that might be something we look at going forward. Then on liaison appointments, just a reminder that the I don't know if we have a printout here or not.
That is my error. I promised to provide you that in writing, and I did not.
Okay.
So.
Our governance policies are a little less than crystal clear about presidential appointments as liaisons, and so just a reminder that we have 3 more citizens advisory appointments coming up this year. I think they're Manager Miller and me and Manager Rodness, but just those have already been approved. But also appointments of managers to attend Metro Mod meetings, and I just appointed us in reverse of seniority order, and there was a quarterly meeting, so October will be Manager Maxwell, Manager Olson will also be there, then it will be Manager Hejmati, then Manager Loftus, and rolling through. So we'll get a printed copy of that. But I guess I won't ask you to confirm that it isn't in front of you, but we'll bring that back, just to be sure that we've crossed our T's and dotted our I's.
I do have the list, but we can also lay it over.
Oh, go ahead then, okay. Let's do that.
So for the mod assignments, there is follows: October 15th, Manager Maxwell; January 21st, Manager Hejmati; April 21st, Manager Loftus; July 21st, Manager Rodness; October 20th, President White; and then into January 19th, 2021, Manager Olson, and then April 2021, April 20th of 2021, Manager Miller.
Thank you. So could I get a motion to approve those liaison appointments?
So moved.
Manager Olson, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Rodness, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you, and we'll get that printout and get it up here in front of us. Yeah, Miller, White, Rodness, that's the CAC for the rest of the year. I can see my note here. And then I would like to propose that we change the meeting date, December 5th to December 3rd, Tuesday. December 5th conflicts with the MOD annual meeting. We'll have both board and staff there this year, so it makes sense to move that back earlier in the week.
December 5th, is that a Tuesday?
It's a Thursday, then we move to the 3rd, which is the Tuesday.
Oh, okay.
I have it as the 12th.
12th is what I showed.
Yeah,
Is that not right?
the 5th would be the first.
Oh, no, for this year, we were able to do it every other week through November and December because of the holidays, and not
Oh.
jam them up, so I think there is one on the 5th.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it should, the normal schedule is the second Tuesday, but
Okay.
So this is instead of Thanksgiving Thursday, maybe? Is that right?
I wish I had it in front of me. I'm
Right
sorry I
here.
don't. Well, the printed schedule.
Oh,
We
okay.
adopted a schedule in
Yeah.
December, and
I'm sure the 3rd is on my calendar, whichever one it replaces.
well, I'm 99.9% sure
Okay.
that's right.
Doesn't matter.
It's the 5th and 19th in
Okay,
December.
great.
5th and 19th, okay.
So could I get a motion to change the meeting on the 5th and reschedule it to the 3rd?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second,
Manager Maxwell?
Tuesday the 3rd.
Yeah,
Yes.
It's a board meeting.
yeah.
Okay.
That'll be a tough one. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thanks very much.
And then move the 26th to the 19th.
And there, look back in the December packet. I know that there's a list of the calendar.
My calendar isn't smart enough. It just does 2nd and 4th.
We've so often run into
Yeah.
problems of having you approve checks like on the 18th of the month or something.
Yeah.
It really gets to be hard.
Okay.
So I was happy. to
December
work-
meetings will be the 3rd and the 19th.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. Operations and Program Committee report, Manager Loftus.
Thank you, Madam President. We discussed 3 items. The first was the St. Louis Park land opportunity. Staff presented the facts of that opportunity and will be coming back with an environmental study on conservation possibilities. The second item was the communications transition plan. Our administrator informed us of the vacancies in the community and education, or communication and education department, and the work plan through the end of the year that will get us through until the strategic communications plan is done, and we can use that as our guide. And then the third item was simply an update on the AIS master plan that the LMCD has been working on. The watershed has participated in one stakeholder meeting, and where it stands right now is that there is no specific timeline. It's being adjusted, and perhaps the processes as well, so it's pending. But staff gave us a nice update on it. And those were the only 3 items we discussed.
Thank you. Citizens Advisory Committee meeting report, Manager Maxwell.
Yes, that was the first meeting I had, the Citizens Advisory Group. It was well attended. It was really fun. They really seem like they know what they're looking for. There was 2 items for discussion. One was the framework, that the stakeholders engagement process that we want to go through. It was the process and scope, the engagement goals, target audience, engagement strategies, key messages, and process and timeline. I think everybody was pretty much agreement. There were just some questions about, how do we get people involved, and how do we go after the key stakeholders, and then maybe how to work with the contractors separately instead of that. So the other one was research and monitoring. And I think the main out of that was, how do we simplify our successes for people to really understand what we're talking about. And that was pretty much, I think that was the main goal, to also look at, if we fail on something, how do we simplify it too, to make people understand that too. Because we will have failures, we'll have successes too, but we should be able to convey them both ways and which way we want to do that. So, and I'd compliment the staff. The staff did a great job on both those items. They really know what they're doing. They're respectful and honest, and had a lot of answers and a lot of good questions. So, thank them.
Thank you for your report. The upcoming meeting and event schedule is listed here in the agenda. Manager Miller will be attending the October 2nd Citizens Advisory Committee meeting. And then notes the Metro Mod meeting also where Manager Maxwell and then Manager Olson will also attend. We'll move on to open a public hearing for the Arden Park construction update. And look to Ms. Domjancic. And I misspoke, didn't I? This is not a public hearing, it's a presentation.
It's in part of the agenda, yes, but yeah, just tonight, just not.
Thank you.
Good evening, President White, managers. Tonight I'd like to provide a construction update for the Arden Park Restoration Project. I'm going to kind of go back way to the beginning so that everyone is kind of apprised of construction progress over the last couple of years, or excuse me, 9 months. I'll give a brief project overview and then go over construction progress from January to September, an overview of the budget, update, and then the next steps for both phase 1 and phase 2 of the construction project. Just to orient you, this is the site plan from the construction plans. This is a little odd because the text is upside down, but north is at the top, which I thought would be more helpful in orientation. So the north of the project is at 52nd Street, south of the project is at 54th Street. Brookview Avenue is to the west of the project, and then Minnehaha Boulevard is to the east. This shows the new stream alignment highlighted in light blue. There are new trails on both the west and east sides of the park, which I'll touch on a little bit later in the presentation. The new shelter building is kind of in the north central part of the site there, that sort of semicircle shape there. The new playground is that kind of kidney bean shape to the north of that. The new bridge that runs between the shelter building and the trails in the west of the park is in the center of the park there. And then new boardwalk and new bridge across the creek in the northern part of the park is at the north there. And then I'll touch on all those elements as we move forward. The first element of construction is actually demolition and removals. The contractor started right away at the beginning of January with removal of the shelter building built in the 1960s. It came down in all of about 15 minutes. It's a pretty quick work of that. And then the contractor moved on to demolition and removal of the low head dam that was in Minnehaha Creek. It's a topic of a lot of conversation during the planning phases of the project. It came out relatively quickly, although it was the source of some additional construction costs. The design underestimated the amount of contaminated sediment behind the low head dam, and so that increased some construction costs. And then later into construction, when we went to do a stream meander through this corridor and under 54th Street Bridge, it was discovered that the dam actually extended underneath the retaining wall that's on the left side of the screen there. So that required removal of that retaining wall, and also increasing construction costs. We did have the bridge engineer, SEH, look at that retaining wall and determine if it was structural to 54th Street Bridge, and it was determined to not be. So now that bank is stabilized by vegetation and also some heavy boulders. Next, we moved to the concrete underlayment, the concrete apron underneath the 54th Street Bridge, which was removed in order to achieve the design grades for the stream meander. And then next, we moved on to removal of buckthorn, the invasive species buckthorn, throughout about 7 acres of the woodlands in Arden Park. Also removal of all of the ash trees that are in Arden Park over 8 inches. City of Edina determined that this would be the time to remove proactively all the ash trees that we would probably lose through emerald ash borer, and as well as any trees that conflicted with the trails and the creek meander. And moving on to the stream meander was the next phase of the construction project. Although this was occurring in January and February, we still had some flow in the creek related to snow melt, ice melt, that sort of thing. So the creek was dewatered between 52nd Street and 54th Street. The creek was essentially just moved downstream by pumps, which created a drier working environment for the contractor. This first section of the creek was the first new channel dug. You'll see off to the far right side of the screen there is the old channel, which runs by the hockey rink. So that was put offline, and then the new channel dug to the east here. A large pool was excavated, and then you'll you'll see off the left-hand side of the screen here are some large woody structures that were used, but some of the trees that were removed as part of the project were used for these large woody structures that were repurposed. You'll see there's logs inserted into the banks themselves, as well as logs set upright to act as pins, which create a stabilized stream bank, and we're able to plant into those areas as well. And they also deflect boaters as they're coming down the stream, and also that large wood creates good cool habitat. That's another view of the reuse of these large woody structures with the root wad sticking out into the stream bed, and then the trunk attached to the root wad is into the stream bank. Once the new channel is dug, then we moved on to building the FES lifts. This next series of images shows the construction of these fabric encapsulated soil lifts, which create the new stream bank. The subcontractor used forms, as we have done in other stream restorations, where the form is set up next to the new stream channel, and then fabric is laid into that form, and then backfilled with soil, some small rock, as well as some seed, and then that all gets wrapped up like a burrito and staked into place, and then you have a constructed stream bank. This is an image that our white drone pilot was able to take for us. We've had now 4 drone missions flown during the construction progress, so we'll have some really great imagery to use in social media and our communications about the project. As you can tell, the soil lifts are very engineered looking, but you'll see in some images a little bit later that they have become really well vegetated, and they are, that surface is more obscured now that they are vegetated. The next piece of work the contractor undertook was installation of these large habitat holders in the stream. The goal of the project is to create excellent habitat in the stream and also make for interesting paddling, which these large boulders do provide both. Then there's also some smaller rock riffles associated with these larger boulders that create habitat for smaller invertebrates and also a food source for larger fish. Another drone image here that shows that sort of break in water that the large boulders create. So they have a little bit of a pool behind them, which provides some sheltering area for invertebrates. And we've also heard from paddlers that they create a really fun paddling experience to a little bit of water within the park. The next phase of work included building the bridge abutments and the helical piers for both bridges and the boardwalk in the northern part of the park. This is a pretty challenging piece of work due to high creek flows. We went really straight from winter into spring rains and a lot of fast snow melt. So this proved to be pretty challenging for the contractor, but they were able to stabilize the creek banks right away, get straw blanket and hydroseed on all of the exposed soil areas. So they were able to really get on top of any sort of erosion control needs that we needed due to the high creek flows and fast snow melt. And the contractor also dewatered a lot of the areas, all the kind of critical areas they were working in, so they could move forward with the work. But the high creek flows and the fast snow melt were certainly challenges for the project this spring. These are the abutments for the boardwalk crossings that go over the stormwater swales on the east side of the park. Again, these also need to be dewatered because they would fill up with, there's some groundwater issues as well as just creek, snow melt into these areas, so another area needed to be dewatered. And then moving on to trails, bridges, and boardwalk. This site plan shows all of the new trails in yellow here. I can kind of run through all of those. And there's new sidewalk on the Brookview Avenue side of the park, the western side of the park, that runs the entire length of the park. That area did not have sidewalk presently, and so people were forced to walk in the street. So that new sidewalk provides access to the western side of the park. There's also trail connections into the park from Brookview. To the north there, there is a staircase that comes off of Brookview Avenue down the slope, and then connects to the boardwalk, and then to the bridge across the creek in the north, and then across to the playground in the northern part of the park. The Brookview sidewalk also connects to a trail that runs down to the hockey rink, both bituminous trail down to the hockey rink as well as a set of stairs. That Brookview sidewalk at the very south also connects to 54th Street and to new sidewalk on 54th Street. And then on the eastern side of the park, there's a new trail that runs past the new playground area down to the new shelter building, and connects to the new arterial bridge in the center of the park, as well as a natural surface trail that runs kind of the southeastern part of the park through the floodplain area, so that's accessible as well. So all trails comprised really do create a really improved access throughout the park. There are certainly areas that were inaccessible prior to the project putting these new trails in, so I'm really proud about that. Here's some images of the trails that I'm talking about. This is the new northern boardwalk that connects the floodplain area across the creek to the playground, which is in the distance there. There's the new northern bridge across the creek in the northern part of the park. This bridge is a 50-foot span and is 6 feet wide. It's purely a pedestrian bridge. There's no vehicle access on this bridge. The Northern Woodland Trail is the trail that comes up from the boardwalk and then connects to Brookview Avenue at the top of the trail. This trail will get a railing. It's just under production right now. And this is the Brookview sidewalk at the top of that set of steps. The Brookview sidewalk, like I mentioned, runs the length of Brookview Avenue along the western side of the park. And then these are the steps that run from the Brookview Avenue sidewalk down to the hockey rink. The hockey rink boards are actually removed now. The city will be replacing them this fall. As I mentioned, there's also a bituminous trail that runs from Brookview Avenue down to the hockey rink, and those are supported by these small retaining walls. The bituminous trail is not put in place yet. Our contractor is waiting on all the areas to be prepped for them to get in there and lay the bituminous down. That's one of the final steps we're looking forward to. An image of the main bridge installation. The 2 bridges were craned into place in late June. Pretty big operation with the crane moving these large girders into place. We did restrict creek access during this period. We made sure that no paddlers were coming through the project site while we were putting these bridges in place. Some cool imagery of the first supports going into place. And there's the finished product. And in that previous image, you see in the foreground there, there's one of the creek accesses. There's now 4 places within Arden Park where people can access the creek. In the upper left there is kind of a typical creek access. There's one at the northern part of the park just south of the new bridge, one adjacent to the new shelter building, and then one just north of 54th Street Bridge. And these are great because at any creek level you can really access the creek based on what the flow is like throughout the year. That lower right-hand corner picture is the new fishing access just south of 54th Street Bridge where that nice pool of water is where people like to fish. I'd like to step to the stormwater system. It's a 2-stage system essentially. So stormwater comes into the creek from about an 80-acre drainage area into the northeastern part of the park and then enters this pretreatment structure which takes out floatables, any kind of larger waste that comes off of our streets, and also any petroleum containing substances. And then that pretreated stormwater then enters the stormwater swale system. This photo is a few weeks old. We've had more planting done since then, but you'll get the general idea that these are essentially large rain gardens, large excavated basins that are filled with engineered soil mix, compost and sand together that will filter stormwater as it enters the swale, and then that filtered stormwater goes down to a drain tile system, which connects these 6 stormwater swales before discharging into the creek. So two systems of treatment for the stormwater. There's a stormwater swale, a little more planting in it, and we have had some questions from the public about the condition of the stormwater swales and how they're looking, and I think people thought they would be more vegetated, but we're just expressing to people that we need some patience while the plants get established and fill in. There's a lot of planting in the swales, and so we're confident that they will eventually fill in and that will be sort of obscured. And then on to vegetation. We have been concerned about the stream banks and their stability under the high flows that we've seen this spring, but they really have done well. We have had a couple areas that the contractor will need to repair because water's gotten behind the fabric before it was staked in. But for the most part, the stream banks have done really well. That seed mix that we put into the soil lifts is germinated, so they're pretty well vegetated, and there's additional planting to be done as well. The woodlands that have been removed at Buckthorn have been something that we've gotten a lot of positive public comment about. People are enjoying their views into the woodland. And so those slopes have now stabilized first with erosion control blanket and a seed mix that will fill in eventually. And those woodland areas are also planted with bare root trees and shrubs. This photo is from April, and it's more vegetated looking now. But we did receive Conservation Partners Legacy Grant funding to do this bare root planting in the woodland. So about 2,000 bare root trees and shrubs are put into the woodland where we took out the buckthorn. So we'll see some vegetation come through there. As a separate project, the City of Edina worked with a private specialty nursery to bring 10 large spaded trees into the site. We received a lot of public comment throughout the planning phases about the degree of tree removal throughout the park, and so that's something that we really wanted to focus on, is getting some larger, well-established trees into the park. And so this happens to be a 90-inch tree spade bringing an autumn blaze maple into the tree, or excuse me, into the site. This is just north of the playground area. In total, we brought 10 trees into the site. These happen to be the northern part of the park. They're kind of distributed throughout the site where we did a significant amount of tree removal. And they seem to be establishing well. Just in the past week, the floodplain areas have dried out to an extent that we were able to get in and get the floodplain planting going. And so that's kind of a piece of work. And then we've also seen some really interesting germination of the seed bank in some of the floodplain and wetland areas. This area had not been planted. This photo was just taken earlier this week. And just because this area has been disturbed and some of the buckthorn taken out of here and some light being able to penetrate down to the soil layer, we've had some really good germination of some wetland plants in some of these floodplain areas. Like I mentioned, we've had some really high creek flows throughout the spring and summer, which has slowed work to some extent. And a big piece of community feedback about that has been that people have just really been happy to be in the creek and paddling. So although we have been dealing with some high creek flows that have slowed construction, we've gotten a lot of feedback from folks who've been able to paddle it and are really happy with the new path of the creek, the rapid conditions that the habitat boulders provide, and just being able to see into the park as that wasn't possible previously. As I mentioned, we have had also some community feedback about the condition of the swales. And again, just really stressing that we hope that people can have some patience while the plants get established and fill in. We've also had some questions about just how the swales function, and so being able to provide some information about how the stormwater enters the site through the pretreatment structure, flows through the swales, and people have noticed that there's been some standing water in the swales as well, and we've also just tried to put information out about how the swales are designed to draw down within 48 hours, so if they aren't breeding mosquitoes, things like that, or a drowning risk or things like that. We've also gotten some community feedback about people's ability to just see into the park. This area had been cleared of buckthorn and there's now good woodland vegetation coming through. So we're happy to hear that people are enjoying to see into the park from the sidewalks on the perimeter of the park. I'd like to give an overview of the budget up to date. The construction contract was set at $3,085,900. As I mentioned, we have had some increased construction costs. Those have primarily been related to, like I mentioned, the additional work to remove the contaminated sediment above the former dam, and also some stormwater design changes that were required because of some incorrect as-built drawings that we received, and then the need to do some additional FES, some additional soil lifts in some areas where we thought they wouldn't be necessary originally. So construction costs have increased by about $79,000. Where we are in the budget right now is about 78% of the way through. The piece remaining, the 22% remaining, is primarily in vegetation installation and the warranty maintenance period of 3 years, as well as the remaining trails that need to be built in the park. So the construction administration contract, separately, where we have our design engineer providing administration and oversight of construction, was set at $339,400, and we do expect that contingency to be expended given the extended construction season. We anticipated that substantial completion of the project would be at July 1st, and now we're into September because of the high water conditions we've been experiencing. So we are into some we have expended some of the contingency. Just a reminder that construction costs are shared between the district and the city of Edina, with the district taking about 60% of the construction costs and the city taking 40%, and then the construction administration costs are split proportionally. The next steps for the phase 1 of the project are, like I mentioned, the construction of the bituminous trails, construction of the concrete terrace around the shelter building, as well as final grading and stabilization. And then the phase 2 of the project, the city's focused project, will be completion of the playground, replacement of the hockey rink boards, the shelter building being finished in October, and planting around the shelter. I have some images here of the playground that's completed now. It is being closed to the public until the site is no longer under construction, which has been challenging.
The kids took the fence down over the weekend.
Yep. We have been able to try to stay on top of that, but yeah, every time I go back to the park, the fence is back down again. And then the shelter building, this photo is from Tuesday. It's well underway and coming right along and on schedule to be finished in mid-October. And then if there are any questions, you can certainly take those, and welcome you to stay updated on our website.
Thank you for the update. Questions? Manager Wilson?
Excellent presentation, great imagery and everything. Question, when you first showed the swales, there was a mini bridge right there. That's what, a 4th bridge?
Yeah, can we go back to that? There are 2 little boardwalk sections that go across the swales, and we primarily wanted to provide people an point of access into the park from Minnehaha. So those little bridges cross the swale, so there's kind of access right along Minnehaha Boulevard.
They look so much better than a culvert.
They do. Yeah, I agree. You can see this image. Oh, maybe not. Oh, maybe up in the distance there.
Go one more, or back one. No, then forward.
There we go.
There it is.
Yeah,
See,
there.
it
Nice
beats the
little sign.
daylights out of a pipe.
I seem to recall there's something like that at Cottageville Park.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, very similar.
That looks great. Anything else for Ms. Donjacich? Manager Miller, I'm surprised that you are so concerned with this thing in your backyard.
Yeah, what?
I'm surprised you're concerned with this thing that's practically in your backyard.
Yeah, well, it's not quite that close, but, my model in my mind was the Malibu Lagoon restoration. I've been working on it for years. Bunch of state agencies involved in it for just millions of dollars. This thing here is more effective, higher quality, and more usable by more people than the millions they spent on the Malibu Lagoon restoration. It's just in the vegetation and every aspect of the thing. It's just phenomenal as far as I'm concerned. None of these pictures do justice to the plantings. There's like, it's got to be 25,000.
About 40,000.
40,000, okay, way off. It's just unbelievable how extensive the plantings are in the thing. I think it's really going to be imperative, though, that we really explain all the treatment facilities there, both the underground and above ground, and how much area that it treats, because I think that's a huge story. The park is one thing, but the conservation is really a very fascinating story. I couldn't be more pleased with the results. I was at a hockey game in Blaine at the National Sports Center, and one of the parents were talking about it, saying it's just phenomenal. You can't believe it. And I said, do you know who did it? Yeah, he says the Minnehaha Creek and the city and Park Board. And he said there was a bunch of people that were really ill-informed that were against it. But he says none of the regular people in the neighborhood had any comprehension of what was going to be developed. He said it's just beyond what anybody could ever hope for. So, I'm totally unsolicited, 30 miles away. But it was really the quality of the oversight, I think, is really an important part of how this whole thing was finished off, because I know you guys are out there a lot in the engineering, et cetera. So it's really, I think it sets the standard. If we see anything less in Carver County.
Looking forward to it.
And the process is interesting too. That's another success story, because there was opposition, and then there was further community development, a lot of conversation, a lot of interaction, and look at the wonderful outcome. It's just terrific. Anything else? Thank you.
Thank you.
We will move down to the first action item, which is 11.1, Resolution 19078, Stormwater Ponds. Ms. Jonley.
Could you let me know who approved consent? Consent was G.
President White, fellow managers. Tonight I'm bringing Resolution 19078, authorization to award a contract for stormwater pond annual survey and maintenance. As part of the project maintenance and land management program, staff inspects and oversees the maintenance of various infrastructure throughout the district. The majority of the work in that bucket involves stormwater pond maintenance. The district's responsible for inspection and maintenance of 28 stormwater ponds through ownership or cooperative agreement. Ponds are investigated generally on a 3-year rotation, and 6 to 11 ponds are surveyed annually. This year, 6 ponds are due for survey: Gideon Glen in Shorewood, County Road 6 in Long Lake, Excelsior Pond in St. Louis Park, and the 3 Nokomis ponds in Minneapolis. These ponds were all last surveyed in 2016, as shown in this table, and WENC has projected estimates of percent wet volume loss for the 2019 survey. And based on these calculations, the district does not anticipate any of the 6 ponds will require dredging maintenance. This past winter, the district performed maintenance on 2 stormwater ponds, and upon reflection of the project, staff reevaluated our internal process and decided to test a new process by releasing a request for proposals for 2019 stormwater pond maintenance. In previous years, sediment surveys and technical reporting was grouped as one contract, and if maintenance was recommended, a separate contract was sought for design, bid document creation, and construction oversight. In an effort to determine if the district could realize a benefit by seeking all possible maintenance elements as one contract, the RFP was structured as 2 possible scenarios. So, 2 possible scenarios are that we do the sediment surveys, the results indicate that there's less than a 50% wet volume loss, and then a technical report is created and the project is complete. This is the scenario we're anticipating based on those 2016 survey results and the calculations provided by WENC. However, the possibility exists that scenario 2 occurs. We do the sediment surveys. We find out that one of the ponds has greater than a 50% wet volume loss. So in that scenario, the consultant will then do sediment sample and analysis, create the technical report, and then move through the rest of the process with design, bid document creation, and construction observation. So the whole project is captured in that one contract. Staff released the RFP on August 15th, and responses were due September 3rd. Staff received responses from HTPO, WENC, and WSB. A team of MCWD staff evaluated proposals on project methodology, experience, and cost. As basic methodology and experience was essentially analogous across the 3 responses, cost became the determining criteria. Wank submitted the lowest cost for both possible maintenance scenarios. And besides cost, Wank's proposal also included the testing of a new survey technology at their expense. In addition to surveying extra points in critical areas such as the Nokomis system, they also proposed future partnership opportunities with our R&M staff to further identify systems that could benefit from future performance evaluation. Therefore, it is staff's recommendation that the Board of Managers authorize the district administrator to execute a contract with Wank for the annual survey, technical memo, and maintenance recommendation of 6 ponds, and sediment sampling and analysis, design, bid documents, and construction oversight for the maintenance of 1 pond for $32,904.50, and authorizes the administrator to execute change orders as necessary in the not-to-exceed amount of $36,194.95. With that, I will take questions.
Thank you. Is there a motion to adopt Resolution 19078?
So moved.
Manager Loftus, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Williams. Any questions for Ms. Gentleman? Let me ask about sediment sampling and analysis. What might be found? What's being looked for?
That depends on the ponds being surveyed. So a range of costs were provided, and in the RFP we asked specific questions kind of to see what the consultant would say. The MPCA sets out specific guidelines, and all of them came back stating that regular, just the baseline procedures need to be done except for Excelsior Pond, which, as we know in St. Louis Park, might be contaminated. So you would do, so basically everything that's tested for is CPAHs, PAHs, and then arsenic and copper, but Excelsior Pond would require a full metal testing.
Okay, thank you.
And they were also doing tests for total phosphorus.
Yes,
Thank you, Mr. Ian.
Could you roll back to the first slide?
This one?
Yeah.
Sure.
This is really, I think this kind of presentation sets forth the policy frameworks and how the work programs follow the policy. It'd be good if we could kind of refine that just a little bit for each presentation to make sure everybody understands where it fits in. It's just not a report, but we've adopted these policies and initiatives, and this is where it fits in, and it's really I like that a lot. It's good.
Thank you.
Anything else? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Resolution 19079 at 11.2, Ms. Christopher, Victoria Local Water Plan.
Thank you, President White, managers. Tonight, staff is requesting approval of Victoria's local water plan. We've been through these a few times, so I'll follow kind of the same outline. First, just orienting you to the area, and then giving an overview of the resource issues and management strategies that the district identified in its plan for this area, and then a few highlights of the city's local water plan, including their coordination plan, which is kind of a primary element that we look for, their implementation plan, regulatory authority, and wrap up with our staff's recommendation. So first, City of Victoria occupies approximately 10.5 square miles in the southwest portion of the district, shown in the red solid line, and it also has an orderly annexation agreement with Laketown Township, through which it will ultimately about double that area, as shown by the red dotted line. So they encompass parts of 4 different subwatersheds, including a large portion of 6 Mile Creek Halsted Bay subwatershed,
Schuts Lake subwatershed, and then part of the Lake Virginia and Lake Minnetonka direct subwatersheds with a bit of Smithtown Bay. Resource issues out here are many, but kind of some of the main ones identified in our plan are a number of nutrient impaired lakes, including several in 6 Mile, as well as Lake Virginia and then Tamarack Lake in the Schutz subwatershed. There's also issues with degraded habitat and ecological communities and increasing runoff volume and some local flooding. So in general, the strategies we've identified for kind of the Virginia, Schutz, and that portion of the Lake Minnetonka subwatershed are protecting them from degradation through our permitting program and then pursuing opportunity-based stormwater management projects in coordination with communities and private development. And then of course, 6 Mile Creek Halstead Bay is a focal area for the district that has a much more robust management strategy that was developed in coordination with local partners, including Victoria. So as the board knows, the district and city have a successful history of partnership and some existing documents in place that outline our shared commitment to really effectively integrate land use and water planning, including our 2015 Memorandum of Understanding, the 6 Mile Creek Halstead Bay Subwatershed Partnership documents themselves, and then the Chain of Lakes Greenway Policy and Implementation Plan that was developed for the Western Growth Area and incorporated into the city's 2040 comp plan. So the coordination plans, as I mentioned, are an important element of all the local water plans, and in this case, it's really just building on these existing documents and just further outlining how we intend to coordinate in terms of regular meetings, coordination on land use planning, aligning investments, as well as regulatory and education program coordination. So as for their implementation plan, they identified a few street reconstruction projects that are kind of in the next 5 years, for which they will investigate opportunities for stormwater management and coordinate that with the district. They're also looking to purchase another street sweeper so they can increase the frequency of sweeping in priority areas, and then routine pond maintenance for existing ponds. And then really a substantial part of their capital improvement plan is a mirror of the district's capital improvement plan. It incorporated a lot of the same projects and talks about how the district, or how they will partner with the district to identify and program those projects. So finally, for regulatory authority, the city does not currently have and is not proposing to acquire implementation authority for any district rules. And they also will continue to defer local government unit status for the Wetland Conservation Act to the district. So staff's recommendation is we verified that the plan meets all the necessary requirements. And as I've mentioned, it strongly reflects the city's commitment to working with the district in partnership, and staff is recommending approval. Any questions?
Is there a motion to adopt Resolution 19079?
So moved.
Manager Olson, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Miller? You look like you have a question.
Not a bit.
Oh, okay. Any questions from Ms. Christopher? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you.
Thank you.
We're moving to item 11.3, Resolution 19080, approval of Phase 2 of the IT consultant contract, and we have Mr. Steele.
Thank you, President White, managers. I am here to discuss the Phase 2 contract amendment with our IT consultant, WSB. Before getting into the meat of the contract and the scope of services, I want to provide a brief overview of the genesis of this initiative and just touch on and refresh on the goals and the timeline of the major milestones so far. And then I want to touch on and review the Phase 1 deliverables and recommendations that came out of WSB's report, and then finally digging into the Phase 2 scope of services and budget. So the 2017 Strategic Alignment Plan identified the need for information technology investment by the district to enhance internal workflows and to increase public interaction. So in pursuing this directive, the district established a cross-functional IT team whose directive was to develop a course of action to improve the district's technology utilization. So the IT team developed goals to guide the comprehensive IT update, which you see listed there before you. Improve our data and our analysis, which drives informed decision making, and to match our technology structure to our organizational emphasis on collaboration by eliminating technological barriers and silos. So as a refresher on the major timeline, or the major milestones, the IT teams established in July 2018, and their major piece of work was conducting a business process analysis by taking a really deep dive into our processes and our workflows to flag all the shortcomings with our current systems. And that business analysis really informed our RFQ that went out for proposals coming back in. And with WSB being ultimately selected for the first phase of work. So WSB's Phase 1 work included digesting that business analysis and conducting their own discovery process and gaining an understanding of the district's technology needs. And at the end, which culminated at the OPC meeting last month, recommending a short list of potential commercial off-the-shelf solutions to address our technology needs, and then recommending a phasing timeline, as well as recommending a budget to procure software, but then also the consulting services that go along with implementing that software. And as I mentioned, that was presented last month at OPC, which brings us up to today. The amendment to the IT consulting contract to start Phase 2, which is really taking that Phase 1 work and actually getting to work and starting to look at software and starting to actually get it deployed and implemented. So WSB's work in Phase 1, they identified 4 key technology solutions to implement in Phase 2 to support the district's IT update goals. So first is GIS, which is the foundational piece of this IT update, and it's the backbone to support all future software implementations. There's also permitting, and following permitting is the data collection and the analytics piece, which supports the research and monitoring workflows. And finally, the enterprise resource planning piece, which has the potential to support multiple functions within the district. And of course, the most important piece of this Phase 2 process, as was recommended in Phase 1, is connecting everything into GIS. So the recommended phasing that came out of Phase 1 and was presented before the before OPC last month is starting with GIS, that base foundational piece, and then moving through permitting and then the data collection. So the Phase 2 scope of services. In Phase 1, we were able to get a budget to help us plan. We got a short list of vendors for each solution. So now Phase 2 is really the work of getting that software up and running and working for us. So GIS goes in first, as it will serve as a central platform and the hub for organizational data. And then following the recommended phasing, we begin the evaluation and selection process for the permitting system. So I'll come back and touch on that process in general in a few slides here. So once we have selection and approval, we do the work to get it up and running, the system implementation piece. And if there's a web component to that software, so for example, the permitting system, if there's a online plan submittal piece or paying permitting fees online, there's going to be active and open coordination and communication between the district, WSB, and Vendy, our website developer, to make sure that everything will be able to connect in with each other. And of course, the last piece is refining those long-range budget planning numbers to inform the future phases in the 2021 piece, but also to give the district a good idea of what it's going to take to maintain all this IT investment into the future. So once it's up and running and humming along, that we know what it takes to keep it that way. So I just want to circle back to this graphic for a second, just to highlight why GIS is going in first and is going to be the central hub. It's going to be the central mechanism through which we utilize and analyze data throughout the organization. So we start pulling in natural resource data and land use data into GIS. And filtering that and using it with all our internal data, we can start increasing our communication through the website and through web mapping applications, and really enhancing that public interaction piece. And then also it supports our workflows. For example, here, all that data can be filtered in and utilized and analyzed, and we have the tools to really supplement and help drive implementing high quality capital projects. So you can see as GIS is the center and connecting everything into there, we can start inching closer to achieving some of those goals that we set out at the beginning of this process. But to circle back to the scope of services for phase 2, I just want to walk through the system evaluation and selection process. So we start with that short list of vendors that were identified in phase 1. WSB, our IT consultant, will assist us in refining the evaluation criteria and then facilitating demonstrations with the vendors in which staff will then run through the evaluation. And depending on how those results shake out, WSB will solicit proposals from the top vendor or vendors, and from there work towards final selection. So each software company is unique, and we don't know what implementation services they provide right now, but through this process and defining a scope of services, we may find that they don't provide the services for implementation that quite meet our needs. So WSB has the capacity to step in and fill those gaps. So at the end of this process, WSB will compile all those evaluation results, the vendor scope of services, what WSB's scope of services are going to be through implementation, and all be packaged together and come back to the board for approval. And then once we have final selection and approval, we can move on to implementation. So the major deliverables out of system implementation are the user acceptance piece, where WSB will ensure that there's a thorough testing plan in place and to oversee any staff testing and to work with the vendor to resolve any bugs. And making sure our unique implementation is well documented. So all the configurations and the settings and all the connections that go into actually setting up a piece of software to connect and work in our infrastructure and with all the other pieces that we've implemented, we want to make sure that is well documented for future reference. And then of course, providing adequate user training, and then WSB can step in and even tailor that user training to our specific workflows. And then during launch, WSB will be on site to be the go-between us and the vendor to resolve any big technical issues and then troubleshooting smaller issues here in-house. So WSB they'll wear 3 hats through the system implementation phase. Their main role will be as a project manager to oversee the vendor and make sure that scope of services and the timeline that we've negotiated with the vendor are all being met and the deliverables are coming in as expected. WSB will also serve as our IT expert, as we don't have a traditional IT department here at the Watershed District. WSB will play the role to make sure that the really technical pieces are being done to best practices and to make sure that each decision point won't cause a ripple effect for future system implementations. And as I mentioned in the slide before, they have the capacity to fill any gaps in the implementation process, which will all be packaged as part of the approval piece that comes before you. So this should look pretty familiar to you. This comes from the presentation of WSB to the OPC last month. The consulting budget for 2019 is $29,500, which really starts work on that GIS piece, that foundational piece, getting that implemented. And then 2020 consulting budget is $60,000, which starts building on that GIS platform, start developing some actual tools that we can use in the field, some pieces to interface with the public, and then starting the evaluation and the selection process for permitting, and then moving into implementation with that, and then the data collection and analytics piece, which is the R&M workflows, that moving through the same process. And then there is a $15,000 contingency as well, which accounts for some of the uncertainty that exists in the process and any issues that may arise as we move through this work, and requires the district administrator approval. So staff request board approval on the Phase 2 amendment to the IT consulting contract with WSB.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Is there a motion to adopt Resolution 19080?
So moved.
Manager Rognes, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Olson, any questions for Mr. Steele?
This is the first time ever that I felt comfortable about IT. You know, I always consider it just a lost cause, and that somewhere or another we're not going to accomplish what we set out to do, and there's going to be no end to the request for additional funds. This is, if it works out anywhere as near as clearly as the presentation, we're in good shape. I really feel good about it.
Terrific. Anything else? Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Good luck.
Do you have the new server schedule?
I don't have the schedule. I checked in with Kathy. She's with military duty this week. She said there's pieces arriving with our managed service provider, and they're working on some licensing.
Great.
And that's the last update I have. But I don't have the actual
Looking
schedule.
forward to it. Okay, thanks.
Sounds pretty quick. We'll move to item 11.4. Mr. Dietrich has a resolution 19081 for us.
Thank you, President White, managers.
Is this the presentation I'm supposed to criticize?
Yes.
There's none you aren't supposed to
Okay.
criticize. So
If you've been waiting all night, this is the
Yeah.
I can keep the floor open for 5 minutes at the beginning. President White, managers, thank you for having me here this evening. Before the board for approval is Resolution 19-081, authorization to contract with Smith Partners and Wank Associates for permitting program alignment and rural business support. A little bit of a mouthful of a title, but tonight I'll just be going through the background on the permitting program alignment process thus far, the scope of work, the contracted amounts, and then finally a staff recommendation. So really the permit program alignment is, its genesis was out of the 2018 comprehensive plan. And an easy way to think of what we're doing with the entire process is really fulfilling the policy commitments that we made in the 2018 comprehensive plan. And one of the foundational tenets of the plan is the balanced urban ecology policy, and it really serves as the district's underlying organizational philosophy, as we're all familiar with. And really in tandem with the policy, we did a strategic planning initiative that was internal to the organization. And really out of those two things, we ended up redefining the mission of the permitting program. And that was protecting natural resources from degradation associated with land use, and then also encouraging partnerships with public and private partners. So really these same goals are reflected in our program alignment process, and really we just look to expand on them and make them a little bit more specific. So out of that process, we came up with promoting early coordination and partnership to identify opportunities to achieve greater natural resource benefits. And then secondly, to improve the efficiency of baseline regulations. So we're aligning staff time with natural resources, risk, and opportunities. And then finally, improving customer service. So we had a series of conversations with the CAC starting in August of last year that really built off of those original goals, concluding in February of 2019. So 6 conversations, and really those conversations served as the baseline for the scope, the foundation of the scope that we were coming up with for the work that needed to be done to get us to a point where we can accomplish the goals that we outlined. And then in March of 2019, the information that we had really taken from the CAC in developing that scope was packaged together for the OPC, and we reviewed it at that time. And I'll go through just some of the high-level categories that we came up with in just a second. And then as you saw last month, in the PPC meeting, the external stakeholder engagement process, so that'll be operating in parallel with what we're talking about this evening. And then finally, this month, Becky and I were at the CAC meeting providing the same stakeholder engagement update. So for the March 2019 OPC meeting, we really took all of the information that we collected from the CAC that served as the foundation of the scope and came up with 4 main categories of work. And those are rule language, the administrative process, the compliance program, and finally the partnership framework. And while I know that everybody's familiar with them, and I'm not going to go into excruciating detail here, we basically came up with these 4 main categories, the issues that are associated with these categories, and then high-level objectives for how we can solve some of these issues. So since the committee saw this in March, we've been refining this internally so we can really start breaking it down into discrete tasks so our consultants can digest it and then come up with quotes so we can get a scope of work going. So the scope of work really has 5 main focus areas, and you'll notice that it's framed a little bit differently here, but basically what we're looking at for mapping the governance framework, rule standard consistency and compliance, and simplifying and streamlining rule language. Those 3 things are all under the rule language category. The administrative process that we outlined that needed to be addressed, that's really being handled through the IT plan and most of what Mr. Steele was just presenting. And then the partnership incentives and compliance program are the other 2 pieces that we're talking about. So I just wanted to tick through very quickly on what each consists of. But mapping the governance framework is really going to be a focus on outlining MCWD's role and scope within the regulatory environment, making sure that that framework is clear and that there's some sort of understanding that's out there on what other agencies do, what their scope is, and where they fit in, and then highlighting where we fit in that entire regulatory environment. And we flagged this because really there's really no clarity on agency roles and responsibilities, and we've also heard that reflected through some of the preliminary findings in the strategic communications effort. And we're really just doing this to provide clarity on our own rule language and eliminate duplication where we can. This is also where we're going to be focusing on single-family homes and seeing if there's alternative ways that we might be thinking about processing our lower-risk natural resource permits so that staff time can be aligned with some of the higher-risk permits and thereby aligning them with opportunities as well. For the rule standards and consistency, this is more focused on the municipal separate storm sewer system permit that's coming out later this year. Just as a quick recap, the MS4 permit really governs all of the different things that cities have to do in operating their storm sewer programs. And they also set forth rule standards and language. And as of right now, with the new standards, we'll be inconsistent with those, and trying to make our program more consistent with that overall language is just going to make it easier on everybody when we're looking at permits and other projects in municipalities. And then we're also trying to understand how that impacts our goals of partnership, and how that also impacts our flexibility in the rulemaking process. We're simplifying and streamlining the rule language and process. That one's pretty straightforward. We're basically taking the language that we already have in our rules, knowing that it's very legal centric, very technical, trying to convert that to plain language so it's easy for our users to understand what we're doing with everything. And then drafting any of the necessary legal documents that are associated with that. So that's sonars or feedback that we get through the technical advisory committee. The partnership incentives piece, that's really just looking at mechanisms and methods that we can use to encourage early coordination, develop partnerships, and then create a reliable process and a repeatable process. And it involves a lot of coordination, a lot of policy research, drafting, and then finally editing. And then lastly, the compliance process. It's really just articulating what our process is, what the recourse is for those steps, the range of actions the board has available to it should a compliance matter be elevated to that level, and then how we work with our municipal partners. There's also some smaller pieces where we're looking at financial assurance updates, mapping a clearer process, but it's really all of the work associated with that. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the scope of work that we're looking at. So we released the scope to both Wank Associates and Smith Partners because they are uniquely qualified for this work, just with their intimate knowledge of the district, its programs, and certainly what we're trying to do with this entire program through the alignment and rule revisions. It makes them uniquely qualified. So we received quotes for, in total, $19,674.50 for Wank Associates, and then $51,290 for Smith Partners. And I also broke it down by year so we can see the costs here. And just for context, the rule revisions budget is $40,000 in 2019 and $65,000 in 2020. So with that, staff is recommending approval of the resolution. And again, that's a contract with Wank Associates for an amount not to exceed $19,674.50, and a contract with Smith Partners for an amount not to exceed $51,290. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dietrich. Is there a motion to adopt Resolution 19081?
Move approval.
Manager Miller, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Maxwell, are there questions for Mr. Dietrich? Manager Olson.
This might be for council too. When you said we're going to simplify the language, are you offering explanations for what the language is, or are you rewriting it in plain, understandable?
So it's actually going to be a combination of both things, Manager Olson. We're looking at converting the language into plain readable text. So where we can, trying to simplify it while still maintaining our ability to legally enforce those rules. We're also going to be providing out-of-text guidance that guides our applicants on what to do and how to do it, and then what submittals might be useful, and also kind of tailor that to their applications. And then the third piece is really trying to incorporate very easy to understand standards. So it's not completely in engineering lingo. There's a plain language explanation of what we're looking for.
Terrific, thank you.
Manager Miller.
This will be a first relying on an engineer and an attorney to clarify the language. But I know they're both really familiar with what we're trying to accomplish, so I'm really glad that I'm willing to take this on. Is there a model someplace that we can use, or are you going to start from fresh ideas?
Madam President, Manager Miller, I think Mr. Dietrich explained trying to start with the commonly adopted technical standards, the MS4 standards, and so that's kind of being a platform. What I would say is after that, and I think I've said this on other occasions, it's not a matter of really doing a broad national search for best practices for watershed regulation, because Minnesota is pretty much a unique context. But I also think probably one of the fundamental differences between the process that Mr. Diers mapped out and past experiences is that we set out with some policy goals, gathered lots of stakeholder input, and worked through language multiple times to try to satisfy and compromise and balance a number of different competing interests. And that is usually the process that leads to more complicated language. So one of the unique things about the process here is gathering a lot of the board's strategic direction and your strategic alignment about what you want to see happen at a broad policy level, having the Citizen Advisory Committee members in depth provide input about the elements of the process, what doesn't work, what needs improvement, getting other stakeholders who are involved in the permitting process, and then trying to develop something clear and workable that both is enforceable but has clear, simple language for explanation. I think that process is well positioned to avoid 12 drafts of compromise based on 3 years of meetings. I think that's what we're trying to avoid.
Thank you.
Anything else from Mr. Dietrich? Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you.
Thank you.
Resolution 19082 is approval of the 2020 budget and work plans and announcement of the public comment meeting. Mr. Whisker.
President White, managers, President White, as you just noted, we've got Resolution 19082 and 19083. They can be considered separately, but obviously they go together, and those are before you for action tonight. 19082 is essentially 3 parts: adoption of the 2020 budget in an amount of $15,350,177, adoption of the 2020 work plan, and announcement of the public comment period. I'll note that the resolution will need to be edited on the fly because the public comment period further out into December was set for the 5th, and earlier this evening you just rescheduled that meeting, so we should edit that to the December 3rd date that's been agreed to. Resolution 19083 is certification of the levy that goes along with the budget and work plans in the amount of $9,675,993. As you recall, just recently we had the public hearing in August where we detailed into the record the budget, breaking that down into all of its components, the overall work plan, and revenue sources, including the levy that support that work next year. No public comment at that time or since. No questions or redirect from the board at that time, and so there's really no recap of the presentation this evening. We're just requesting board action on both resolutions. Ask you to consider those individually and then look to legal counsel to work us through roll call.
Thank you. Is there a motion to adopt Resolution 19082?
So moved.
Manager Rodman, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Miller. Any questions or comments before we go to the roll call vote? Mr. Smith?
Manager Loftus.
Aye.
Manager Rognus.
Aye.
Manager Miller.
Aye.
Manager Olson.
Aye.
Manager Maxwell.
Aye.
President White.
Aye.
Manager Hishmati absent, 6-0.
Then we'll move to Resolution 19083, which is certification of 2020 levy. Is there a motion to approve or to adopt?
Move approval.
Manager
Second.
Miller? Second, Manager Maxwell. Any questions or comments before the roll call vote? Mr. Smith?
Manager Loftus.
Aye.
Manager Rognus.
Aye.
Manager Miller.
Aye.
Manager Olson.
Aye.
Manager Maxwell.
Aye.
President White.
Aye.
6-0.
Excellent. Going to the added item 11.7, which is Resolution 19077. This is authorization to release a request for terms for the note refinance. Mr. Whisker?
Yes, President White, you noted when the board was considering consent that Manager Miller had reached out to me and asked that we pull this for consideration of a few minor revisions. Just by way of background, and as you just mentioned, it's authorization to request proposals essentially for refinancing of the existing Wells note on this building. It was the original $2 million note. We have a mandatory tender date coming up in November. And so we're seeking to refinance the outstanding $1.3 million. Some of the revisions that are suggested is we always route proposals through a single source, and that's usually on anything that we do, the project manager. In this case, it's our operations manager. Manager Miller had suggested that on all proposals, not just this one, those be routed through the administrator care of the project manager. So folks know that those are supposed to be directed to me, so that's for your consideration. Similarly on all proposals, we also ask that respondents, if they have any questions, that those all get routed through a single funnel point of the project manager. In this case, it's the operations manager. Manager Miller had suggested that outside of questions regarding the content, if there are issues or concerns that a respondent had, that they have access to either the administrator or president to voice any concerns about process or anything else. And then I'd also recommend that in the resolution, the board include that you're authorizing staff to release the request for terms for the refinance of the 2012 note on advice of, including non-substantive items on advice of bond, general counsel, and our financial advisors. They have proofed this, but just in case before release there's any final need for minor clarification or edit. So those are three things for your consideration.
Thank you. Before I ask for a motion to approve, I just want to ask clarification. The points about the contact person doesn't require any change in the terms of the resolution, I don't think.
Not in the resolution, but in the RFQ, it says the department head does mention James, and it says that no other person shall be contacted.
Okay.
And I think that's just not good policy. If somebody feels that they're not being treated properly, or that there's grave confusion or bias or whatever, that they got a right to, without being disqualified, to contact the board or the chairman or whoever they want to.
And had you written down a specific amendment you'd like to see?
No, just strike the I haven't got it in front of me.
I think the modification would be in the actual, for your consideration, doing this on the fly, in the summary of terms or the RFQ, under the inquiries section, all inquiries should be directed to the operations manager and the district's municipal advisor, and then just the addition of some sort of content around if there's concerns, that those can be directed to board president or administrator. And then similarly, that the proposals can be submitted to the administrator care of the project manager, which in this instance is the operations manager.
Okay. So that is on page 4 of the document. Okay. So, Mr. Smith, as a matter of process, can I ask for a motion on that resolution as verbally amended, or do I need a motion and then a motion to amend?
Madam President, the first is fine.
Okay.
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Manager Maxwell. Any further question or discussion? Those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you very much. Thanks for bringing that to our attention, Manager Miller. We'll move to the Administrator's report. Mr. Whisker.
Find it.
Okay.
Yes, Madam President, managers, a couple of items. On September 30th, there's a pending deadline for watersheds across the state to submit any proposed resolutions to the Minnesota Association of Watershed Districts. That's something that President White and I have discussed. We're not recommending any resolutions. We don't have anything that's really on the docket. So this is an opportunity to get this on your radar. If you have anything that jumps to mind tonight, or even after the meeting, you can follow up with me or President White, and we could be positioned to then bring that back at the next September meeting for board consideration. I guess as a point of background, we haven't submitted resolutions in probably the last 3 years.
The last one I remember was about the iron filter. But was there one after that?
I just recall the PE or the coal program.
I don't remember.
So no
Okay.
burning interest. If something comes to mind after the meeting, please
Right.
follow up with me or President White. And like I said, we can do some background research, frame something for consideration at the next meeting.
Thank you.
Next up, a couple of items of correspondence that are sitting out in front of you. One is a September 6th letter from staff to the Board of Water and Soil Resources. This is something that's been in front of you before. The board's authorized several comment letters on the state's proposed shift in watershed-based funding, a component of the clean water funding. I'm not going to get into it in detail, but there's a final sort of informal comment period that Bowser's staff issued before their board considers final action on the policy that they have framed. And so with the time that they allowed, we weren't able to route comments through the board, so they were issued from staff. We've also included comment letters that are companion to our letter from MAUD, drafted by Emily Javins, their executive director, Capital Region, Prairie Lake, Spring Lake, that are all pretty similar. Generally, the areas of comment are the funding allocation formula. Bowser has not yet disclosed what formula they will use to determine how funds are allocated, which is central to the entire policy, and everybody seems to have taken issue with that. Don't adopt the policy until you've clarified how you're allocating the funding. Also looking for clarity before they adopt the process on what they expect in terms of work plan development. They've called for work plans to be prioritized, targeted, and measurable. We know that the approach that's being put out there will cause a lot of the watersheds within these boundaries to be in a negotiation mode. So we think it's incumbent on Bowser to heed the recommendation, the Metro Multi-Stakeholder Forum, that said you need to require prioritized, targeted, and measurable in your policy for the work plan process. There's also some clarification that we're seeking about eligibility of plans vis-a-vis soil and water conservation districts. You can scan that in the letter. And then just clarification on what are the eligible activities. It's been our recommendation, the recommendation of others, that the funding be skewed and emphasized towards implementation, bricks and mortar, and clean water projects, not so much studies, technical assistance, admin costs. So very consistent with past comments. I think the note here is that there's a small window of comment available to us. Bowser's going to be considering this, and it's our recommendation to them that they not adopt an incomplete policy, that they take the advice of everybody that's solicited along the way and fine-tune those last pieces before they adopt it. So that is that, unless there are comments. There is also another letter in front of you that was in response to a meeting that President White, Manager Olson, and Anna Brown and I had with Carver County Commissioner Malushnik, the Carver County Water Management Organization, Carver County Soil and Water Conservation District, other county staff, their public works and feedlot staff, that really came at the request of the Pearson Lake Association. You'll recall that Pearson Lake is the headwaters of 6 Mile, so it's the top of the 6 Mile chain of lakes. And Pearson Lake representatives for a long time have raised, and the board is familiar with, you've toured the sites up there, concerns regarding water quality in the lake as they relate to upstream agricultural runoff. This meeting was about new concerns that have been raised based on monitoring data the Lake Association has chosen to collect themselves regarding E. coli, so bacterial concerns, not nutrient concerns. During the meeting, there was discussion about the state's framework for E. coli monitoring, how the state designates or assesses water bodies for impairment, and what the TMDL framework looks like, and what the regulatory authority is of the state. We were asked by Commissioner Malushnik to essentially connect with Pollution Control Agency staff and report back what is the framework, what does the data mean that the Pearson Lake Association has collected, and then position ourselves to kind of regroup and carry on the conversation. So that's the basis of the letter. The nuts and bolts of it are that while there is agricultural runoff from the north, it represents about 85% of the nutrient loading to the lake that the lake has the whole time we've been monitoring it over a period of more than a decade, and continues to meet water quality standards of the state. So it has been looked at before. It is not impaired. It meets water quality standards. And that while there has been E. coli detected in the runoff from the ag ditch to the north, that the data indicate that the lake doesn't meet the chronic or acute standards or exceed the chronic or acute standards for E. coli that the state has set. And then moreover, the state reinforced in a separate communication back in, I think it was August 6th, which is attached, and then to us verbally that we're representing in the letter, that even if standards were exceeded at some point in the future and the state went through an assessment and TMDL process, because of the nature of the land use being agricultural, there's little to no regulatory authority that the Pollution Control Agency would have to require best practices be implemented on an individual property. So take homes for the board is that the lake actually meets the state standards, and the Pollution Control Agencies provided some feedback on their regulatory authority. We've communicated that out, and I guess our anticipation is that there's going to be follow-up meeting and discussion about what the Pearson Lake residents expect next. So don't know if there's questions about that.
A staff person who was for the county who looked at feedlots and septic systems was also asked to report back. Have you seen that report?
We've not. If you recall, I think there were questions about timeline for deliverables in the meeting. We committed to 2 weeks, and I think missed our deadline by a day. We haven't heard from Carver County, so I know that we're following up with them to try and gauge when they will be following up, make sure we're on the communication.
That was Greg Bowe.
Greg Bowe.
From Environmental Services.
Correct. So they were going to look at some area septic systems up there and some of the regulatory authority and report back in. So when we have that, I'll pass that along to President White and Manager Olson.
Can I ask one question? If the lake were categorized as impaired, would the authorities that the agencies had change?
No. And that's sort of at the root of the issue is, and it's two parts. One is while there have been some bacterial sources detected in the water, they all fall below chronic and acute standards that states set for being detrimental to human health. So there really, from the state's perspective, isn't an issue in the lake. Second, if it ever rose to that level and exceeded standards, they've communicated pretty explicitly that they would not have the authority through TMDL to require best practice with regards to that on agricultural land. So
Yeah.
that's where we stand.
Frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, that's been, I think, the big take home is the lake has very high water quality from a nutrient perspective, and the bacteria doesn't exceed standards. The Lake Association is concerned because they see a ditch transporting sediment and agricultural runoff and are legitimately concerned, and we've taken an approach of working into our 2017 plan and our capital improvement plan a project that would be a protection strategy to keep the good water quality that we have in place, but we have to work with willing landowner.
Yeah.
And outside of willing landowner context,
And being under the state standard.
there is very little regulatory oversight of overland runoff for agricultural land federally, let alone in the state. So it's one
So
of
there's
those.
no stick. Is there any carrot for this?
Well, the carrot for the landowner principally would be, and we've talked about this before, would be financial in nature, and then their sort of emotional tie to the land that they're really enjoying and have enjoyed working for many generations. So we've been in constant contact with the landowner, and what they've represented is when we're ready, the watershed district will be among the first people we'll contact.
So we've explored all our options.
We have, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Manager Miller.
Does the announced rollback yesterday of the EPA water standards, does that have Any impact on us? Okay. Just states that don't have as much management, okay.
I'm not aware what that is, so I just made a note to
Clean
look it
water
up.
pool.
Today you just announced.
The definition of waters, yeah.
Oh, water's okay,
Yeah.
sure. Another update here, Mike Heyman and I met with city manager of Hopkins and their community development director to just earlier this week, I think, to discuss next steps to advance planning and implementation at 325 Lake Road. We had a good conversation about what it's taken to get to this point and what's needed to move forward. We're encouraged by the city's desire to keep working in really strong partnership. And on our part, we discussed the need for a clear pre-development agreement to work through some of those threshold issues that we need to narrow in on, such as the character of green space and the range of options for park dedication, infrastructure needs, ownership and funding of things like public streets or private streets, and needing that kind of clarity, a framework in agreement to work through those issues before we're positioned collectively with the city to issue a request for proposals or from the development community or position the land for sale. So our commitment to them was to get back together soon and start working on outlining framework for a cooperative agreement. And so those are some of our immediate next steps, and we'll report back from there. Been a busy week, I guess. The Watershed District project team also met with city managers and leadership from City of Medina, Orono, Long Lake, and Long Lake Water's representatives this week to discuss a status update on the implementation roadmap that we're developing for the Long Lake subwatershed. The first phase of that work that you'll recall is funded by about a $100,000 grant from the Board of Water and Soil Resources, is synthesizing all the natural resource information, so that first layer in our planning. So research and monitoring has been project managing this first phase of work and doing a lot of work. They've been developing a pretty fine-grained watershed model using field data that is calibrating the model, so we have a much finer grain understanding of where the problems are coming from on the landscape. And then they've been looking at the biological information. They've been doing a lot of the carp netting, the pit tagging and tracking to see where they're going, which will continue into next spring, to figure out what's going on inside the lakes, as well as taking sediment cores from inside the lake to figure out how much internal release there is. That's going to give everybody a really clear picture on what's happening on the landscape, what's going on in the lakes, how it all works together. October to about December, we'll be working with the communities to integrate in infrastructure, parks, and open space development information and start to put that together. And the end game here is to come up with a plan that identifies bricks and mortar projects, activities inside the lake, who's running point, who's leading those initiatives, and where the grant funding will come from to do that work, since we've discussed with the partners a bulk of the work is likely going to only happen through grant funding. It's going to be grant dependent. Other than providing that status update, we just discussed the communication needs of the partners. Long Lake Water is very interested in making sure the board remains up to speed, which we assured them you've received a couple briefings, but also, and I think more importantly, they want to make sure the city councils are bought in. What we've heard